Good morning and welcome to another Social Housing Roundtable. This week I have the brilliant Nikki Holmes joining me. If you don't know Nikki, she is a specialist in cuckooing and county lines. It should make for an amazing roundtable today, and one that's going to be very, very informative. Plenty to learn and plenty to take away. So look forward to having you with us on today's event. Many thanks. I'd say good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining today's roundtable. But most importantly, good morning, Nikki, and thank you for coming on today, because you're absolutely the expert in this, and I'm certainly not. So thank you for coming on today.
Morning, Matt. Yeah, thank you for asking me back.
That's right. So, not sure if people who are in the room were on the roundtable last time that we did with Nikki. If not, then brilliant. Always excellent. Nikki is very much a specialist in cuckooing, county lines and other areas to do with, I guess, ASB that isn't just ASB. I think people hear antisocial behaviour and hear kind of, there's issues with either hedges or drugs down the road. And there's so much more than that. And Nikki definitely specialises in this. She's someone I met via Jim Nixon, who unfortunately can't be with us today, but obviously his community safety podcast, and then Nikki and I got introduced to him from there. But what I'll get Nikki to do is I'll get her to introduce herself to anyone who I haven't met or engaged with. My name's Matthew Baird. I've been running my own social housing recruitment business now for just over a year. Set up in February 21. That's me getting confused of what year we're in now. But I've been doing social housing recruitment for over 10 years. But these roundtables were set up as a means to initially for people to come together during the pandemic and during the lockdowns to still be able to network and engage with each other and see what everyone else was doing. But they've evolved into this culture of change, and everyone who comes onto them wants to see change, wants to learn, wants to bring things back to their organisations and really understand how, what needs to change, and B, how we can do it together and collaboratively in the sector, really. So on that, Nikki, I'll get you to introduce yourself and kind of how this topic's come about today, really, and where your passions lie, if you would.
Thanks, Matt. Morning, everyone. Really nice to see so many people at the round table today. So my name is Nikki Holmes, and I'm the founder of an organisation called Safe Together. You might have heard of us. We've been going since 2020, so we're a relatively new organisation. We provide training and consultancy for all topics related to safeguarding, but we specialise, as Matt said, in the field of exploitation. I began my career as a police officer, and I had a number of different roles when I was in policing. One of the roles that I had was working as an integrated offender manager within the offender management division. I served with West Midlands Police, and that's really where my interest in this area came from. So my responsibility in that role was to work and oversee young people who had committed some very significant and serious offences. What was really unique about that role is that I had quite a lot of time with those young people. I got to know their backstory, and I think that's where I really came to understand that really complex victim-offender overlap. A lot of the young people that I worked directly with clearly were victims of exploitations themselves that led to them committing some quite significant offences. Some of those offences have been committed in a gangs context and were related to drug supply offences. And I think it was my frustration with actually wanting to be able to support these young people, but not within the parameters of policing, and that the parameters of policing didn't allow me to work perhaps in the way that I wanted to. And that essentially resulted in me making a decision to leave police. I then went and worked in the field of substance misuse. I worked as a manager for quite a large service in Warwickshire. And again, working with young people who were being exploited, and their exploitation was very much linked to situations of debt bondage, for example. So clear victims of exploitation, experience of exploitation. Upon leaving that role, I then went to work for Repair Quality Commission. For those of you that maybe don't work in health, might not have heard of the CQC. They are, I would say, the equivalent of Ofsted, but for health as opposed to education. Worked within the children's team, doing national reviews all around the country. And that was really interesting because that afforded me the opportunity then to be able to look at what was happening locally around exploitation, looking at the complexity of the landscape, looking at the struggles that local authorities were experiencing, what was working well, what wasn't working well. And then that's what really triggered me to set up my own organisation, because I was able to take all of that learning and then to provide that support. Because one of the challenges working with the Care Quality Commission, you go in, you do the reviews, you point out where the fragmentation is, where the challenges is, but then you kind of have to sit on your hands and you can't do anything to provide that support. And that's something that was lacking for me, something that I felt that I could do through Safer Together. So in a nutshell, that's why I'm here today. It's a huge passion of mine, raising awareness of this really complex issue. I think that we are at a place where we could potentially be losing a generation of young people to exploitation and the criminality associated with it. So that's why I do what I do.
And for those who are unaware of the terminology, what do we mean by cuckooing in county lines, Nikki?
Okay, so cuckooing is a term that essentially is used to describe when the homes of an individual are taken over or appropriated by another or an organised crime group in order to facilitate exploitation and criminality. And what's really important is that we recognise when we're talking about cuckooing, for those that do know the term, it's not uncommon actually to find that professionals, even those professionals working in the field of exploitation, might never have heard of the term or understand the concept of cuckooing. But for those that do,
I hadn't until our first roundtable, until we were putting it on. It wasn't something, and yet I've recruited an ASB for 10, well, at that point about 9 years, and I'd never heard the term. And I think they're terms which, like you say, can get a bit. People who talk about them regularly know them, but as I say, it's the same with county lines. Again, people go, well, what do you mean?
yeah, it's scratching below the surface, isn't it? And I think it's about widening the lens as well. This is something I talk about all the time. Because even for those individuals and practitioners that do know what cuckooing means generically, often they view it through a really universal lens. So they tend to think about the types of properties that might be targeted by cuckoos as being social housing, for example. And that might be the case. We know that local authorities, with their social housing stock, often that they house very vulnerable tenants. But we've also seen cases of cuckooing that have taken place in university halls of residence, for example, and properties that are privately owned and mortgaged. So again, it's thinking about this in the broadest term, that any property and any individual can actually become targets for cuckooing activity. County lines, I'm sure that most people have heard of the term county lines. What I find though is that even those individuals that have heard of the terminology, I think it's difficult not to have heard about it, because I think that the media interest in this has pushed county lines firmly into the public consciousness. But often what we find is that there's a misunderstanding around the methodology and how the methodology came to be. So county lines is a method of drug supply, although we are seeing cases that is not just about the exportation and importation of drugs. And when we're talking about drugs in the context of county lines, we tend to typically be talking about the dealing of crack cocaine and heroin, but it can also be cannabis as well. And we also see the importation and the exportation of weapons associated with county lines activity as well. County lines isn't anything new. Often we think about this as being quite a new social phenomenon, and it isn't. There was county lines activity taking place in the early 90s, for example. So not something that is new, but something that maybe we're just more cognizant of in recent years. The reason that county lines came to be is because when we're thinking about organised crime groups, we need to remember that organised crime groups, it's all about profitability, the maximum profit they can make through criminality. And what they were finding is that the drug markets within the UK were really saturated. And because they were so saturated and so competitive, the profit to be made from drug supply was actually being reduced. And there was an opportunity that they identified to be able to establish drug markets in areas and locations across the UK where there was a less competitive market, where those drug markets were less saturated and less well established. So they saw an opportunity then to export from the big urban nucleuses, the big cities in the UK, into more geographically rural, isolated locations and communities, for example, coastal communities. Set up the drug market, maximise profitability. Where children and young people come into that is that they are commonly targeted and groomed. The reason being is that these organised crime groups target them and use them because they are, as I say, easier to groom, easier to coerce, but also they were less likely to be suspected by those working in law enforcement and other agencies as being involved in drug supply. So they tended to go under the radar and be able to run those lines, those deal lines, and to establish those markets.
Amazing, thank you. And like I said, I think sometimes we can throw terminology out there, and it's just making sure everyone kind of has an idea of the focus of today and where we're trying to combat. So I know you're working with a number of organisations. So I'm going to open this up. If anybody wants to come in at any time, please use the reactions kind of raise hand function or put something in the chat. I'll be monitoring all as we go along and bringing people through. We want this to be a discussion and a Q&A or however you want to do this today. Whatever anybody wants to ask, feel free. But I guess my first kind of conversation point to yourself, Nikki, I know you're working with a number of organisations and providers to help provide solutions to a number of the topics we've just discussed. Is there one thing that if you could just go in and go, right, everyone needs to do this now? Is there one thing that you're kind of going, this is what you must implement immediately? Or is it a staggered approach to a number of different, is everyone kind of different, I guess?
Yeah, I think it's definitely, every location is different. There was a report that came from the Children's Commission, It's Still Not Safe, which is a really good read if you really want to raise your awareness of this issue. And I think that highlighted the fragmentation around the country in terms of responding to this really complex challenge. And the problem is really complex. So there is a need to look at how local areas are using public health infrastructure, for example, to target this issue, how they are monitoring and quantifying rates of serious youth violence that are often linked inextricably to county lines and child criminal exploitation. With Cuckooing, that's a really interesting one because often what I find is even those local areas that are doing a lot of really innovative work to tackle the issue, Cuckooing isn't part of that agenda. And what we know is because Cuckooing is often linked to county lines methods of drug supply, not always. So we might see cases of Cuckooing that are about cannabis cultivation, for example, or someone's property might be used to facilitate sexual exploitation that's not linked to criminal exploitation. But often we do find those links with county lines methods of drug supply. But what we do find is that Cuckooing is dealt with as a separate agenda. It often isn't high in terms of strategic priority, and Cuckooing often is dealt with as an adult safeguarding issue, and it can't be. We have to look at Cuckooing in the context of child protection as well, because of those links to county lines activity. In terms of what I think that everywhere needs to do, I think awareness raising is really important, good quality education is important. We are, I would say, with child criminal exploitation, where we were historically with child sexual exploitation. When we would talk about victims of child sexual exploitation in the context of child prostitutes, we would talk about them in a way that they had agency and that they had complicity in the situation that they were being subjected to, that they were somehow consenting to their abuse. And that almost seems unbelievable now when we think about that, but it wasn't that long ago. And I think we are still in that space with criminal exploitation. We often dehumanise young people who are being criminally exploited. We often struggle to look beyond their criminality. And we absolutely need to be better at that. We need to be looking at the child first and foremost before we're looking at the crime that they've committed in that exploitation space. And that's not to say that, you know, we shouldn't be responding to their criminality, because it's very serious. It can devastate communities, it devastates families, but we must be child-centred and we must look at the child first. And we can't do that until we have a much better understanding of exploitation, grooming and coercion.
Amazing, and I think some really powerful points there, particularly about the idea of giving young people agency. Has anyone who's here today kind of got a question they'd like to bring up, a discussion point? Has anyone got experience of supporting Cuckooing themselves that they can share with the group? Oh, David, do come in, come off mute, absolutely. You're on mute, David.
I understand that. I understand the term cuckooing. What I still can't get my head around is why county lines. What when you asked and you just explained about the county lines and it's the method of drug supply, but what's the county line bit? What does it mean, that bit? Is this something that I'm missing here? Is it so, like say Northumberland or Cleveland and North Yorkshire? Are we talking that type of county lines and how the police can get involved or not?
Do you sort of mean the links between county lines and Cuckooing, understanding how they can be? Just
county lines in itself, that, you know.
I think it's the terminology where the term.
Yeah, the terminology. Yeah, so I think the term really came to be because the fact that the importation of drugs tended to be in those sort of rural locations, isolated locations, those counties away from the urban areas where drugs were exported from. So I think that's how the terminology came to be. In terms of how young people often don't talk about county lines. They know what it means, but they often talk about going out of town, going cunch. That's another term to describe it. But the line itself refers to the deal line. So often the mobile phone line that is used to arrange a distribution and supply.
Right. Okay, yeah.
But it's often referring to that geographical element of it, because, you know, typically what we saw when county lines began to emerge is young people travelling large geographical distances, you know, in order to import and those drugs into those areas, into counties, rural counties, for example. Not always the case. Sometimes we see much more local models of county lines and drug supply now being in place. There's definitely been some shifts in the exploitation landscape linked to COVID. But yeah, and that's really where the link to cuckooing comes in as well, where we often see those links between county lines and cuckooing. Because for those young people that are operating those more traditional county line supply networks, where they're travelling those large distances, and when I say they're travelling, we need to remember actually they are being trafficked to travel.
Yeah.
But you know, they will often be coerced and forced to find an outpost, a location where they can establish permanence in that location that they're infiltrating. And that's where the cuckooing comes in. The way to do that is to cuckoo a property, so they have a place in order to facilitate drug supply.
No, thanks for that. I particularly look after homeless people who were referred to as by local authorities, and they have extreme needs. And I've seen people visiting properties who do not belong there, and you think, what are you playing at here, coming and going? And then I just report that then to adult services and things. So yeah, thanks for that.
I think that's sometimes as well where some of the complications are, isn't it, Nikki? It's kind of like, well, who actually takes responsibility for this? Who is the because there's a housing provider, there's your local authority, there's the police, there's your, like you said, there David, your safeguarding commissioners. Like, I think there's so many kind of, to me, there doesn't seem to be an accountability for one person to go, right, I am dealing with this. And I think that's obviously, Nikki, where a lot of your consultancy comes in and goes, actually, this is what you need to be doing.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, you know, going back to the point that I made about cuckooing, needs to be considered in the context of child protection. Might not be linked to county lines, but frequently we know it is. And where there are concerns about county lines activity, we need to be thinking that there's a really high likelihood that children and young people may be present and frequenting that address. And it's not just about those young people that might be trafficked for the purposes of county lines that are in that address. We need to think about those young people that may be dependents of the vulnerable adult in that address, that are linked to family members that might be frequenting that address as well. So again, it's really about widening our safeguarding lens when we're tackling these issues, making sure that everybody's around the table. So something that I kind of talk a lot about is that this is not just a law enforcement issue. This is a public health issue. So we need to see health at the table. We need education. We need the police. We need the third sector. We need everybody to be playing their bit and taking accountability and responsibility to tackle these issues.
Yeah, agreed.
No, look, and fantastic. Anybody else kind of got anything they'd like to kind of bring in? Yes, Marie, thank you for joining us today.
Morning. Really interesting, Nikki. I'm interested in the the practicalities of what you do in your consultancy, really. Can you talk me through a bit more about what you actually do? Is it solely to sort of social housing providers, or is it wider, just so I can get a better idea of what you do?
I work with a range of organisations, really. So I've done work with NHS England, I've done work with local authorities, work with the third sector, work with education. We've got a wide reach in terms of who we work with. We've done lots of training as well for housing providers, for example, to understand the complexity of this issue, all of the typologies of cuckooing, because I think that's really important as well, is that often when we talk about things like cuckooing, we think about the use of force, and that's not always the case. Often what we see is the use of false pretense, and it's a very nuanced issue, which adds to the complexity of the situation. So we offer training, we offer consultancy, we work really closely as well with the West Midlands VRU, the Violence Reduction Unit, do some work with them as well. And we've got links to the Home Office and a piece of work that we're doing too around internal concealment. Known the standard term for that as plug-in. So we're developing a protocol, doing people who are exploited criminally are at a huge health risk, psychological risk, trauma, and part of that is some of the practice that they are forced or coerced into when they're involved in drug supply. They're coerced into drug supply. So yeah, we work with a range of organisations, really.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you.
They're absolutely brilliant, and I think this is the understanding just how broad this topic is. And I'm going to bring Nisha in, and then I just kind of want to touch back to that idea of what impact cuckooing has had along with COVID, really, and the impacts and changes there. But Nisha, over to you first.
Yes, I wanted to ask a question about landlords, about what social housing landlords, about how they're doing. How are they looking into this? Because I think there's been a lot of I've read in the media about some landlords being arrested for I know one of them was arrested for, he had 27 properties or something, and 15 of them were taken over by they rented the house in a normal under rental agreement. It was nothing to do with social housing, which was a private landlord. But they found, I don't know, millions and millions worth of cannabis being grown in those properties. And she, until today, she claims to be completely ignorant of it. She did not know that was going on, but she was arrested as an accomplice. So how do you protect yourself, and how housing association, I can imagine if especially maybe the property is left empty for a while, in between people being there, I don't know.
I think it's a really good question, and I think it's a real area of challenge, isn't it, for those landlords that have those private rental agreements, because the law states that they should have a knowledge of what's happening inside their properties, and that they can be seen as being complicit if things like cannabis cultivation is taking place in their properties. I think the challenge is for those landlords is sometimes that they have a number of properties. Whilst I can't comment on that individual case because I don't know the facts of the case, what I do know is that there's a lot of landlords that have properties, a number of properties, rent them out, and might not even live in the UK. So how can they oversee what's happening in there? So I think it's really difficult and a real area of challenge. And I think that really highlights again some of the real variance and complexity of this, and that actually landlords could also be victims of this practice. Maybe that the law doesn't protect them.
I'm just thinking about how can landlords be social housing, even in council property. How can they ensure that this doesn't happen in their properties?
Then also it's with the tenants that they've got, if they are, be it private landlords who do supported accommodation or domestic violence, whatever it be. Unfortunately, those can be, as Nikki's mentioned there, prime examples of people susceptible to cuckooing. And so, you can speak to your tenant and say, how's the property? And they can say everything's fine. And you've done your due diligence on your prospective tenant. But then if actually they are being manipulated and groomed and the rest of it, that's where the issues escalate, Nikki.
Yeah, and I think as well, it kind of really highlights the fact that there's just not that awareness raising. There's not that awareness of this issue professionally, there's certainly not awareness of this issue within the community as well. And I think that raising awareness of things like cuckooing and putting this kind of on the table, so everyone's aware of it, of the fact that it is happening in plain sight in our communities, that would go a long way in terms of helping those landlords to recognise that this is something that they need to be aware of when they are entering into those rental agreements. Thinking about the signs to spot, you know, damage to property. Are they even ever thinking about cuckooing if there is damage to property? Probably not. Are they doing those visits and those checks when they're renting out those properties? Or are they just kind of taking the rent and just, you know, happy for things to tick along, and then maybe sort of doing those checks when the resident might move out? So I think it's always about raising awareness of this and recognising that it's not just professional awareness raising that we need to think about, but also within our communities as well.
Completely agree.
Yeah, I do think, Nikki, your presentation, whatever, you should go to every person who owns a house. I think they should know about this.
And this is exactly why we wanted to put the roundtable on, Nasha, because we,
Yes,
you know, there's
fantastic.
a point in these, because there's so many areas, a bit like when we did yours and we were talking about fostering and the need for 80,000 fosterers in the UK. There's so many topics we don't know about, and so things like this raise awareness. Claire, thank you for being patient. I'm going to bring you in, and then Maria, Maria left a comment which I'll come back to in a moment. But Claire, over to you.
Nikki, I wonder whether you or you know of an organisation that provides general awareness training for housing providers for the staff, because it's staff on the ground, it's housing officers, it's neighbourhood assistants, it's street wardens, it's estate rangers who would actually be seeing the signs of this happening in our communities. So I'm just wondering who the best provider is of training for that.
Yeah, we provide a masterclass on cuckooing. We've provided this training for a range of organisations, including you know, those working in housing. It's really tailored to be there for everybody. So it's about looking at, you know, that public health approach, what that means. It's looking at the typologies, it's looking about the signs, it's looking about what to do if you identify or suspect a concern. And it's really important, actually, I think, training for those organisations and those individuals, as you say, because they are the eyes and the ears of our communities. They're the ones that are on the ground. They're the ones that have that interface and that link. And interestingly, you know, I think some professions that we don't think about that are eyes and ears in relation to this issue as well are pharmacists. So we've provided some training around this for Lloyd's Pharmacy. They often are the ones that have that interface with those individuals who are vulnerable in terms of maybe mental health, you know, individuals that maybe are drug dependent, that go to their pharmacy for their medications, for their methadone consumption. So yeah, it's thinking about targeting that training to all of those individuals that work in those community contexts, and as you say, are the ones that see this in practice, making sure that they have the skill set to be able to know where there is a concern and what to do when they do identify a concern. So yeah, if you want any information about that, Claire, happy to pop my email in the chat, and then you can drop me a line if that's helpful.
That would be great. Thank you, Nikki.
I'll be sure to share your details around, because I think the one thing that's becoming clear again, and I know it did last time we ran this, is actually, again, people going, hang on, this is much bigger than we thought. This is a much bigger issue, and we thought why we wanted to bring it to the table. Maria's put in the chat that Renee Marie Young runs a consultancy for landlords called Specialist Housing Solutions to help explore their responsibilities. So I think, again, they'll probably tie in a bit there. She's in a podcast, which is released today, that I was on. I didn't realise that was coming out today, Marie. So thanks for the slight plug there. So yeah, Marie's latest episode of her podcast is out today, which is brilliant. One thing I was going to say to you, Nikki, my family, when I was about in my early 20s, moved to the Lake District. And I don't think I've ever been anywhere. I mean, don't get me wrong, I grew up in Plymouth, so there was a fair bit of drug use, but it was a big city, and I mean, it was never my bag, but whatever, I ignored it. But I was amazed at how much there was in places like the Lake District, in your quiet little rural towns, largely because there was nothing else to do for a lot of the young people there, but also because of the, I think the lack of policing, the lack of, you know, you don't have cameras on every street corner, you don't have people watching all the time. Obviously, I think those places will have been affected by COVID and things like that. But have you, I guess through your experiences and the landlords that you've spoken with and the housing providers and everybody else, how have you seen COVID affect both rural and urban uses of kind of cuckooing and of drug use, particularly across that kind of county lines area as we discussed before? Has it affected it massively?
Yeah, definitely. The Dame Carol Black review that's highlighted how we've seen real increase in terms of substance misuse. I think that's often linked to the fact that those individuals who were vulnerable and had care and support needs, the way that services were able to provide support shifted overnight and changed overnight, and many organisations did their best. But the reality is that the way support was offered changed. I think a lot of individuals experienced isolation and loneliness that had a real unprecedented impact on loneliness and mental health. In terms of rates of exploitation, I think that the pandemic actually created the perfect storm. So it's a real myth that because young people were at home, that they were safer. We know that home just isn't a safe space for a lot of our children and young people. And even actually those individuals where home is safe and there wasn't any family dysfunction before the pandemic, all of the pressures on parents to manage homeschooling, to manage work, to manage their own trauma around COVID, for example, particularly in the early days, before there was a vaccine, before there was any kind of like ray of hope that we were ever going to get out of this, it put a lot of stress on families, and so young people might have experienced challenges within their home environment. For young people as well, being homeschooled, spending more time online, we know that online spaces and social media platforms are used commonly by those that seek to groom and exploit young people. So actually, we thought that they were safe at home. The reality is that, for some young people, their risk was amplified by the fact that suddenly they had this more time on social media. They hadn't got those peer networks that they relied upon. They were lonely, they were isolated, they were bored. And we can't ever underestimate as well the impact of boredom on a young person. So often when we think about young people who are at risk of exploitation, we only think about certain cohorts. We only think about young people that are out of education. We only think about young people that are from families where there is dysfunction, abuse and neglect. And what we were seeing actually is a real shift in the demographic of young people who were being targeted, increase in females, increase of young people who are referred to as clean skins, which is a slang term for those young people who have got no criminal footprint, no criminal history, and also a change in the methodology as well. So, I talked about how traditional county lines models often involved trafficking over large geographical distances. So you might see a county line, for example, that starts in Merseyside, goes down to Plymouth. That's one example of a county line. But what we were seeing is that young people who were being trafficked in that way were more visible during periods of lockdown, during periods of national restriction. So if they were on a train, for example, and schools were closed and we were unable to travel from one local area to another because of the restrictions that were in place, those that worked in law enforcement, for example, British Transport Police, were doing some great work at intercepting those young people, stopping them, searching them, recognising that they were a victim of exploitation. So one way to avoid that was to change the methodology. This is one of the most complex factors of working in this field. I always refer to it as sand shifting beneath your feet. You suddenly think that you're getting a grip of it and a handle of it and you're understanding the intelligence and what it's telling you, then it changes. Organised crime groups are always one or two steps ahead. And sadly, because of systemic challenges and infrastructure, we sometimes don't keep up with that enough. But what we saw actually was a real shift in the methodology that was being used, much more local methodology. So young people, for example, that were being trafficked to operate within the local area that they live or within their own county, so not crossing local authority borders or perhaps maybe hopping into the next local authority if they live close to the border but back. The challenge with this is that often one of the red flags is when a young person is missing from home. Then we think, okay, this is a red flag, we need to be thinking about exploitation. A lot of these young people were being trafficked, exploited and groomed, were back home in time for tea. So parents were key workers, for example. They were going out, they were thinking that their child was safe at home. And there was a number of child safeguarding practice reviews that highlighted this. So often we tend to, again, view this through a narrow lens. We think about young people as being or having an exploitation risk if they're out of education. What about those young people that are homeschooled or that are not attending school because school is actually quite an anxiety-inducing place for them? And we know, again, that there's been a real challenge in the number of young people who have not returned to school when schools opened again. There's about 1,000 young people across the country that were unaccounted for example. So some real challenges around that and some of the shifts in the methodology and the exploitation landscape that can be attributed to COVID.
Amazing, and some really incredibly important messages coming through that. I'm going to bring Marie in a second, but Dee, I noticed you came off mute there, and I know at the moment you're doing a number of work with young people. We were talking about this last week in terms of, particularly in the Birmingham area, young Black people who were trying to change the narrative around their options and things on those lines. Are you hearing similar stories, regarding Cuckooing? I don't know if you'd heard the term before today, but are you hearing terms like this coming up quite regularly?
Yes, good morning, everybody. I co-run a youth organisation called Birmingham Says No to Knife Crime and Youth Violence. And everything that I've heard from everyone this morning, it just really does hit home with what we're contacted by young people, we're contacted by parents of young people, and even professionals. And I was specifically just about to mention the bit about the amount of young people that are currently going missing. It's on the increase. We're hearing sometimes up to like 2 a day. If not more, and sadly they are getting younger and younger. And I was just about to ask Nikki, do you find that there is seems to be a connection with the amount of young people that are going missing, and a connection with the county lines operation?
Yeah, definitely, there is a real connection there. We know that frequently young people who are missing are victims of exploitation. I think though as well that we need to broaden the narrative in relation to missing, because I do think that sometimes we only think about risk for those young people that are missing overnight, when actually that young people that might be just missing for sections of the day are at equal risk as well. But a definite correlation between missing and exploitation, 100%.
I mean, it seems it's kind of like the whole line of this sort of, this scenario, it comes down to, in my eyes, vulnerability on all levels. You've got, like we've mentioned before, predominantly, the Cuckooing, the properties that are used are mainly very vulnerable adults or adults with addictions, and they just get lured into, don't they, their properties being taken over. And then you've got the young people that are groomed and then brought into them properties. How can we just tackle it all? Because it's just massive. It's just on such a big scale from the bottom right up to the top. I don't know. Are we on a winning battle? Are we starting to win in this, or is it just a constant losing battle, and is it only going to get worse?
Such a good question. For me, I always feel like, would I say it's a battle that we're winning? No, I think that there are glimmers of hope that we see in some local areas. I think until we stop demonising young people, until we start and understand their lived experience, until we start to understand the reasons that underpin exploitation, and we take a more broader, holistic view of that, we're still climbing that mountain. So for me, one of the things that I'm really passionate about is that, when we're talking about young people that are gang involved and gang affiliated, for example, often we dehumanise them.
Yeah.
We don't look beyond them as, we label them as a gang member. We don't look beyond that. We don't look beyond their criminality. But I think it's really important that we understand from their experience why being part of a gang network is so appealing for young people. The amount of young people that you speak to, and they talk about the fact that they've had bullying, the fact that they've had no security at home. the fact that they've been marginalised, the fact that they've been experienced to lots of intersectional trauma. So is it really that confusing for us to understand that they've now getting validation, that they're getting that sense of belonging from a gang network? And I think that this is the thing, when we're educating professionals and young people, it doesn't go far enough. It's about, particularly for young people, we tend to tell them what's right, what's wrong in a very binary way. We need to understand their lived experience from their perspective, and we need to relate to their experiences to our own experiences. As human beings, as professionals, as adults, we all want to belong to something. We all want to feel that sense of belonging and security. And if we're fortunate enough to get that from our families, if we're fortunate enough to get that from our professional networks, great. But for these young people, they're often not fortunate enough to get those things and that sense of security and belonging from pro-social sources. So they form their own networks. But it's about not dehumanising young people, making sure that they are part of the solution as well. Don't do things to them, do things with them.
This is kind of what, this is kind of what we've picked up on a lot. We've got the biggest youth following in the whole of the country. How it happens, I don't know. But a lot of what we're kind of picking up is young people just feel that they are not listened to. And I honestly don't think they are. It's kind of, whether it be at home, whether it be at school, and you've hit the nail on the head, they're listened to in their cliques, whether it be down the park or in the playground. And that's where these relationships are formed that can lead them on, down the line of vulnerability. And I think once we start listening to our young people a bit more and respecting them as human beings, then I think, that would be a great step in the right direction.
Yeah, I totally agree, Dee. And I think as well, human beings and also the experts, they are the experts in the world that they are navigating. And, for me, I think another thing we need to think about, contextual safeguarding. It's a framework that's been around for a while now, since 2016. The work of Dr. Carlin Furman, she's actually a professor now. It's pivotal. We need to be not just thinking about risk, abuse and trauma that happens in family contexts. We need to be working contextually, and we need to be confident and competent to do that. Think about all of those spaces, places that young people navigate and the risks to them in those sort of contexts and spaces. I still don't think that contextual safeguarding is as embedded as it needs to be. So yeah, I think that it's amazing the work that you're doing, Dee. And your organisation sounds like it's doing some fantastic things, but listening to young people is key. I think the other thing, when we're thinking about the definition of exploitation, part of the definition of exploitation that is really contested quite commonly is around that notion of exchange. So that a young person is somehow part of their exploitation because they're getting something from that exploitation. Mm-hmm. And I understand the reason why that's contested. The reason it's contested is because it somehow suggests that a young person is complicit in the situation that they're the epicenter of, somehow complicit in their exploitation and abuse. And absolutely not. They cannot consent to being exploited. They cannot consent to being abused. But what I think we need to be careful of when we're having a dialogue around the definition of exploitation is that it's really important that we are not negating to think about that child's need and that unmet need. Because if we overlook that and we don't unpick it and explore it and actually have the conversations about, okay, so what is that person giving to you that you're not getting from elsewhere? If we continue to overlook that and not have those conversations with young people to understand what their needs are, what needs are not being met, if we don't meet them as agencies, exploiters will. And so I think it's really important that we have those conversations about unmet need as well.
Really appreciate it. And, there's this huge network of areas, but I think, Dee, as well, the other area is that we keep having conversations like this. We keep having more and more people made aware of what's going on. We use networks like yours, Birmingham Says No, saying, that this is going on and it's okay to talk about it. It's okay to come and have these conversations. It's okay to question. And I know Nikki mentioned earlier about, and Dee have both mentioned about the amount of young people that are coming through. And you talked there, Dee, about missing people. We've also got a generation. I know Dee mentioned there that they don't feel like they're being listened to, but they've also got a more powerful voice than they ever used to have. I mean, as young people, I think for generations, people feel they're not listened to, but the voice and the reach they can have now, but also the access to information, the access to so much diversity. We've got a more diverse group of young people coming through than there's ever been. Certainly that are openly diverse in many, many different ways. And I don't just mean in terms of, race, but gender and other, and neurodiversity is more aware, there's more awareness around that. There's so many different areas now. And if we're not listening to young people, as both you and Nikki have pointed out there, we're really going to struggle to get on top of understanding what it is actually, as Nikki's pointed out there, what it is why they're getting involved in this in the first place. Because it's so easy for us to go, oh, it's because it's money, oh, it's because of X, Y, Z. Well, actually, is it? Because we're not asking. And this is one of the big issues that housing providers and a lot of these roundtables over the last couple of years have pointed out, is assumptions. And assuming we know why these things are going on, and assuming we know, why what is going to be best for tenants, residents, young people. I know a few people here were on the roundtable we had at the beginning of the year, with Hannah Harvey from Saffron, who said that for 3 years they were just falling in terms of services to customers because they kept putting in services they knew were going to be better and they weren't being well received, but they weren't asking the tenants beforehand whether or not they're what they wanted. And these assumptions are coming through. And I know, Nikki, that's evidently one of the big challenges you're having with the sector at the moment.
Definitely, and I think that to pick that point up, making safeguarding personal is really, really key. Any person, whether that be a young person who's been criminally exploited, sexually exploited, whether that be an adult who's been a victim of cuckooing, part of being exploited is being disempowered. You've had that power taken away from you. And then what do we do as professionals? We make choices and decisions with their best interests at heart, we think at the time, without maybe even consulting that person, without maybe even talking to young people about the reason why that decision is being made and what this means for them. How do they feel about that? So making safeguarding personal is really important. Something I talk a lot when we talk about cuckooing in terms of a response to cuckooing is, sometimes if we're going to, as professionals, make the decision that that individual maybe needs to be moved, how does that feel for that individual? Because actually you're not just moving them away from risk, you're moving them away from protective factors as well. And I think that that's something that we've seen a lot with young people and their families who have been exploited, have got significant risks to the whole family unit as a result of that exploitation. And that often local authorities think that the only option left is to move that whole family away. And sometimes that's the right decision, sometimes it's not. What we know is from a lot of, again, child safeguarding practice reviews, a common theme is that where that's happened, young people will navigate back to their originating local area, because sometimes we don't think about the protective factors that we've moved them away from and how that actually can amplify risk to them and their vulnerability. So yeah, making safeguarding personal is really important. Don't do something to someone, do it with them. And there will be, of course, sometimes decisions that you have to make. But I think that if you can take that person on the journey, they can understand the rationale behind the decisions and the reasons that that decision has been reached, it's really important. We need to empower people.
We really, really do. And I'm delighted, by the way, to see Jim. I know you've been able to join us this morning, so good morning. I know you had other meetings, so great you could kind of jump on. But I wanted to, because Jim has jumped in, for those who don't follow the Community Safety Podcast, I'm honoured to sponsor it, and it's a phenomenal podcast that's midway through season 2, well, kind of partway through season 2 at the moment. But I know there was an episode last month with Adam Fouracre talking about violence on the street, devastation that occurs, and I mean, all of this kind of ties in with the safeguarding premises. But from the Community Safety Podcast, from your role in obviously head of ASB, from the work you've done with Nikki and others, kind of the discussions we're having around these topics at the moment will still just really resonate and give you the same frustrations as they've had maybe for the last kind of couple of years.
Yeah, I mean, I think we play a really key role as ASB professionals, actually, and this is something that I saw for those who don't know me in the room, my main background was policing for 20 years and very much sort of community neighbourhood policing. And I spent an awful lot of time, when we were picking up on young people that were getting involved in lower risk ASB, we spent an awful lot of time putting in very robust procedures, and very much like Nikki's saying, he's actually having those conversations with the young people and understanding actually what they wanted and what their needs were. And I saw a lot of cops, sort of writing off a lot of kids at a very young age, and where my philosophy was very much about writing them in and trying to look at the talent and the ability that a lot of these young kids have. And it picks up on one of the points that was just made around, delivering stuff to them. One of the most successful projects that I've ever done with young people was back in the early 2000s when I worked in Smethwick in Cape Hill, which is a very deprived multicultural area. And what we actually did was we had a particular ASB problem, and we went out and we actually spoke to the kids, and we actually asked them what they wanted to do. Because I feel sometimes we always talk about sport, but not every kid is sporty. And what we actually did was we delivered them a radio project for their own community. And we hadn't got a clue what we were doing, but we pulled in people that did. And we delivered a really good quality project over a probably 2-3 year period until the funding ran out. But these kids were able to come in a couple of 3 times a week, and they actually were able to work together. It broke down barriers across postcodes as well, which was really significant for me. And what those young kids actually did was tackle some quite difficult subjects, but turn them into radio programs. And we actually allowed them to have their own FM channel and broadcast to their own community for a week, which was really significant. But I think
I think the important thing there, like you've mentioned, ties back into what Nikki was saying earlier with the county lines thing, is it's getting people from different postcodes coming together. But also it's that area of they're talking to each other. So if someone's going, oh, by the way, this is going on, that's a bit weird. Actually, I know someone you can talk to about that, and it's getting those levels of communication across the young people, because they're the ones that are going to listen to each other. When, as Nikki's pointed out and others have pointed out today, and I know Dee and Nash have pointed the same, people aren't listening to adults in the same way as they do their peers, and they never have done.
And I think this is where sometimes, good quality mentoring can come in as well, and I think, sometimes parents aren't listened to, carers aren't listened to, but sometimes you get the right mentors involved, and they can have that sort of turning point in a young person's life and get into the reasons why they're feeling the way that they do. So I think there's an awful lot we can do. And I've certainly proven that over the years that you can do it. I appreciate police resources are pretty low at the minute, but I think if you can get a good partnership sort of going, then you can achieve quite a lot. You've just got to have that joined up approach. It's like we say that all the time, leave the egos at the door and everybody come together and work together. That's half the problem a lot of the time, is everybody sort of, I'm going to be honest here, and sort of steal the glory. And it's not about that for me. It's about, doing the right thing for these young people. And I don't care who gets the glory, as long as we save some of these young people from, life, misery, and even death, and that's the way I look at it.
Amazing. And I know, Nikki, there, this whole idea of the mentorship thing is exactly what you're trying to advocate with a lot of the businesses you're working with as well, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. Mentorship is really important. And I think that, we've got that sort of peer mentorship, or you've got that lived experience mentorship that works really well. Organisations like St Giles has really kind of proven the efficacy of that. But I think, we need to remember that we've all got it in our gift to be mentors for young people. But we need to listen to what they have, and we need to think about ourselves as humans before professionals as well. I think as well, relatability is really important. So have we got a workforce that young people can relate to? I think that that's really important. Young people who may be helping recruit staff for organisations and have a steer and say on that. I think we need to be careful as well that when we do co-production, that's again a buzzword that's bandied around all the time. Is it co-production or is it consultation? Because actually, if we are gathering views from young people and then we're making it more professionally palatable, we're watering it down to deliver in a professional context to a board meeting, for example, that's not consultation, because some of the narrative gets lost when you do that. You know, it's got to be co-production. When we're designing services for young people, it's got to be young people that are involved in the design, right from, you know, the conception of the idea for a service to the implementation. And that's challenging, that's difficult, because you can have a limited amount of time, a limited amount of resource, and a limited amount of money, and then you gather the views of young people, and it kind of highlights that what your thought process was is completely off track. So you might have to go back. So there needs to be a commitment to that. If you're going to co-produce a service, co-produce it, don't co-design it. Really co-produce it. But I think, you know, yeah, I think just something that sort of Jim's touched upon as well is around the talent of young people. We have a system in the UK that I think is quite, it's quite bold to say this, but I think it's complicit in the exploitation of young people, because what we do is we have an education system that puts young people into boxes. If they are good at English, maths and science, they're okay. If they can sit in a classroom and they can nod and be part of the status quo, it's okay. If you've got a young person who doesn't conform to what we determine as being academic, then we might have an issue. If we have a young person who struggles to sit in a classroom environment and to conform to rules that's imposed upon them, we have an issue. And that issue often manifests in that young person being excluded or marginalised. You know, they're pushed out of the education system, and all of that talent isn't tapped into and lost. And then they're given labels, for example, that are unhelpful and stigmatising. And I think that society does marginalise young people. We often think about, you know, that it's kind of parents, it's exploiters, but society has a role to play in it as well. And what you find often with young people who are in a gangs situation, they're very entrepreneurial, and that talent has never been tapped into or recognised by our quite archaic school system and education system.
Well, as I mean, Fiona was just in the chat there, so we've got Suzanne Nade McCall with us. Really great to have you with us, Suzanne. I know you've got your kind of business, the police science doctor, and you kind of use, you know, help police use research to improve policing. And I'm hoping today there's been some really interesting takeaways for you. But she's put there in the chat that it sounds like the kids having their own podcast sounds like a great idea. You know, and these kind of things are so empowering. And to anyone who joined me on the journey last week, I ran in partnership with Sandwell College a whole week focused on how do we get young people engaged in careers in social housing. So it's kind of touched in, kind of not, but certainly some of the eye-opening things for me that came through from that were, firstly, there are so many apprenticeship options available, and yet, and the kids, the young kids, see them as brilliant, can go away. Parents still have a bit of a, and I'm talking about people kind of my age, mid-30s, late 30s, who, you know, when you were going through school, and I was talking about this openly with people from the college, you know, there was this issue around, you know, for me, if you were intelligent, you went to university, and if you weren't, you did an apprenticeship, and that was the stigma that went with it. And yet housing has an apprenticeship. It's not utilised, and we're trying to do a hell of a lot at the moment to really boost that narrative and get Sandwell College to partner to run courses and to do this, because you don't need a degree to go into housing, but you can do it no matter your background, because there are so many different avenues. But there also are right across such a wide spectrum. And if we can engage people with more peer-to-peer networks, such as apprenticeships, such as these kind of things, we can combat so many issues. And as you said there, you know, podcasts, radio shows, whatever it will be. As Jim said, not every kid wants to be, it is brilliant at sport. And even those who enjoy playing it, aren't brilliant, and sometimes go, oh well, if all the good kids are playing it, I won't bother because I'll just get mocked. So they don't then get involved. And this idea of isolation, which was obviously Mental Health Awareness Week last week, is, I think we need to realise so many young people are lonely as well. And I think that, you know, this creates it. Marie's put in the chat there, she's involved as an enterprise advisor as part of the careers at enterprise company school. So I'll be raising this topic at my next meeting. Thanks, Matt and Nikki, great roundtable. No worries, Marie, I know a few people are happy to shoot. Nikki, are there any final words you'd like to share for the group? Because you've been amazing today. Thank you so much for coming on.
No, thanks, Matt. It's always a pleasure, and it's really nice to have the opportunity actually to do this roundtable and to meet so many like-minded people who are really passionate about children and young people, you know, making their communities safer. So just yeah, huge thank you from me.
That was absolutely all mine. And as I say, these was much a learning, I think, for myself and everyone else in the room, to raise awareness and to try and get ideas together. And by the sounds of it, everyone's been able to take something away today. So that's been the important thing. Thank you, everybody, for coming today. Next week's roundtable, and I'm just going to quickly put it up because I've just got a complete mind blank. Here we are. So I've got a business called Viewable who are joining us. It's all about looking at innovation in housing. What can we be doing? And actually what would be interesting is whether, and I'll talk to them beforehand, what we can be doing to try and get more young people involved in projects which focus that, and again trying to kind of combat these early issues. No worries, Suzanne. you can chill in your pajamas all day. That's not a problem at all. But thank you, everybody. Thank you, especially Nikki. And we'll catch up with you. And David's put 64 this year, and things have not changed in my lifetime with you putting young people into boxes. That is the challenge, I guess, David, and one that hopefully we can try and combat. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for joining today. And
see you guys. Good to see you. Take care.
Thank you. Take care.